This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Good afternoon, you're listening to Resource Center. I'm Angeline Teh. All businesses started from entrepreneurship. However, as they grow bigger, they begin to face bureaucracy issues. Today, we have AnwarJumabhoy from BC Consulting, and he saw this problem and decided to embark on a research and interviewed over 100 business heads in Malaysia, India, US, Singapore, and Australia. And so, Anwar, tell us about your experience that led you to write this book.
I think there's a combination of factors, right? So on the one hand, I've been an entrepreneur. So I've had a small business, which was a gym business, gym for kids. I had a computer center for kids. I also have been involved in about 3 startups. So one was a battery manufacturing business in Italy, and a couple of internet startups, one in Hong Kong and a biotech startup in Singapore. So I've had some experience with entrepreneurs and being an entrepreneur. But I've also spent a large part of my time working in large companies. And when you work in large companies, you see stuff, you ask yourself, how does this make sense? Why are we doing this? So my co-author and I, we spent quite a bit of time talking this issue. And Sri Krishna, who's my co-author, used to work for GE. He used to work for the bank in India and then GE. So he's got a lot of corporate experience as well. And he runs now his business process consulting business in Malaysia. And so we looked at it and said, look, there has to be something that you can do for large companies, and there has to be some recognition from large companies that they cannot continue the way they're continuing. Because today we are living in a VUCA world, so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the pace of change is far, far faster than we've seen.
And the big companies especially, can't cope with this.
And big companies struggle, right?
Yeah.
So big companies struggle for a variety of reasons, right? All big companies, and you can name anyone that you can think of, they all started through entrepreneurship. They all started with an entrepreneur saying, this is what I want to do. So, you can look at Microsoft today, you can look at GE, you can look at Ford, Mars, etc., all the large companies, right? And they all started from this idea that they can do something, and they have a level of competence, which we call self-efficacy. So they have a level of competence that they can do something, and they can make a business out of it. Then as they grow, you have the problem of bureaucracies coming in. So then you have the support departments, and you have finance, and then you have matrix organizations, and you have complexity, right? So you have complexity, unfortunately not in the market, but you have complexity inside the company. And then that presents you with several problems. Decision-making is difficult. Gathering of information is difficult. And then there's this desire to centralize when actually maybe it's not time to centralize, right? So there's a wonderful economist called Hayek who got a Nobel Prize. And basically his theory was that you have to move decision-making to the areas where the knowledge is retained. And as you grow a company, the knowledge becomes dispersed. If the knowledge becomes dispersed, then you need to move that decision-making to the area where the knowledge is strongest. Unfortunately, as you sort of grow a company, you get the rules or procedures, SOPs, and that brings complexity, and that brings a difference of focus. When I was at Tune, for example, one of the issues that we had was, because we outsource, Tune Hotels, we outsource our laundry. So one of the responsibilities of the management team, and we have, obviously, as you know, very small set of people running the hotel, there's a limit to the time that they have available, and they have to make choices. And when they make choices, at the same time, we have losses from towels or bed sheets, and then we have to reconcile deliveries from the laundry guy. So, how many did he take? How many did he bring back? And so we end up spending so much time trying to reconcile this. And why do we do that? Because a long time ago, somebody said, we found a mistake, we found a problem with the bill, and therefore we implemented this procedure. Now, you need to then step back and say, okay, what's it costing us? How much are we losing? $50, $100, $200 a month? Is that a big enough number to worry about? But in a lot of organizations, the balance of power shifts, right? Mm-hmm. So suddenly accounts has become more important than operations. And so the managers say, but, so-and-so from accounts department is chasing me for the answer. Then what are they supposed to do?
Count sheets.
Exactly. Whereas in the UK, when we set up a hotel in Edinburgh and we set up a hotel in Melbourne, and both those hotels, we just did away with this. We work on a trust system. We have a laundry supplier. He picks, he counts, he bills. And that frees up staff to do important things like deal with customers.
I find it kind of ironic when a company grow, you put in processes in place to sort of retain the efficiency of the company, but that's not the case with most of the large companies.
Angeline, it's an interesting question. Yes, you put in, there are some processes that you can perhaps improve, right, and increase the efficiency of. And then there are other processes that perhaps you just need to take a different look at, So, for example, General Motors and Toyota. In the case of General Motors, they have different suppliers for their products, so, windscreen, tires, etc. And they've built through a system whereby, the supplier gets a purchase requisite, he sends the items, he gets a delivery order, he sends a invoice, then the people check how many they use, and then they pay the invoice. So they've got, a few hundred people worrying about this payable issue. In the case of Toyota, they don't have a payable issue. They have one supplier for tires, and they know that if they produce a car, they have consumed 4 tires, because the car's not going to get out of the factory without 4 tires, right? So when they produce a car, they consume 4 tires, they pay the supplier for 4 tires. No. There's no need for DO, PO, invoice, reconciliation. You've got to look at efficiency in that way, right? And some efficiencies are worth striving for, and others are not. You've always got to keep a sort of customer focus and in a bigger view on, is this the right thing to do?
Mm-hmm. And so today we're talking about the 9 entrepreneurisms, which large companies can learn and how this can be bought into their company. So share with us, what are the 9 entrepreneurisms?
When somebody thinks of an entrepreneur, they tend to think of personal traits. The guy is self-driven, he's smart, risk-taker, he can organize, he's passionate, etc. And what we're saying really is that you can break down what we call behaviors of entrepreneurs that make them successful. And these can be A, data-driven, and B, they can be learned. So they're not traits. These are behaviors that can be learned, can be institutionalized, and typically held by a team rather than an individual. So self-efficacy is really, the number one entrepreneurism that you need to have, either as a company or as an individual. And GE exhibits it. If you look at GE under Immelt, he's completely changed the complexion of GE, right? So from Jack Welch, which looked at earnings, looked at segments, you need to be number one, you need to perform. And that led to a lot of gaming by the managers. So if you need to be number one in radiology, then they said radiology, right? But radiology is a subset of screening, right? So there was a lot of gaming going on in GE. And GE, in those days, typically made most of its money from financial services. And the financial services, again, was started to support customers, and it became so big. And Immelt has come around and turned the whole thing around and said, look, what are our competencies? Let's focus on our competencies. And our competencies are rotating parts, right? So he's focused on the 3 business units. And he said that the future of the world is Internet of Things. So anything that we produce needs to be able to be monitored remotely. And they've made a huge investment in IoT so that any component, any appliance that they put out there, they can monitor it. And now, of course, that's a huge benefit for them as well, right? For the customer, yes, because they know before a part is going to fail that it's going to fail. Mm-hmm. It should be replaced. But for them as well, because then switching a supplier is a pretty difficult thing to do. So you need to build a company on self-efficacy, right? Your core competence. The other 2 that come to mind when you talk about entrepreneurisms are risk-taking and passion. We did 100 interviews for the book, and probably about half of them are entrepreneurs. None of them said they take a risk, right? So
really?
Yeah. So risk is your perception of what they do, right? It's not theirs. They don't feel they're taking a risk.
Usually I would think of like entrepreneurs who start something, which means they have to give up something else.
Yes.
So that is a form of risk.
But if you ask yourself, Angeline, what are they giving up, right? And what are they getting in return? A lot of young entrepreneurs are giving up a day boring job in return.
Stable income.
Well, in return for, yes, stable income, but in return for a lifestyle that they want, an upside. So it's a trade-off, right, for the entrepreneur. And he doesn't, so in getting what he wants, he's not really taking a risk, right? Because he knows this is what he wants, right? And a lot of young entrepreneurs, raise money from friends, family, etc., or they raise money from grants. Now, if you raise money from your friends and family, there's no risk of that guy coming and, breaking your leg, right? At the worst, you're going to say, Angeline, that money I put in your business, I'm never going to get it back. So there's a social element, right? You take a social risk. We don't take a financial risk. So risk-taking is very, very overstated, number one. And number 2, So if it's risky, there are ways to ring fence it, right? And corporates are good at that. So they need to start to sit down and say, okay, let's take a risk. Let's do some experiments. Let's put aside some money. Let's do something. Because if we don't start to change and learn, chances are we're not going to survive. So we have self-efficacy, risk-taking, and passion. And passion is an interesting one, right? So, I do work with young entrepreneurs, as a mentor at Magic. And basically people just call up and say, can we have a chat? And what do you think? And they're passionate about what they do, right? Richard Branson talks about passion a lot. But Horowitz, in a commencement speech in Columbia this year, said it's more important to follow your competence than to follow your passion. Because your passion will change as you age, as your interests change. So I see some entrepreneurs and say they're really passionate about this thing. Right? I'm working with a few at the moment. And I say, okay, so tell me, how is your passion demonstrated? And unless you've put in some blood, sweat, you really have some knowledge, you can't be passionate. That's just a dalliance, right? It'll pass. So Horowitz says it's more important to be competent. And he gives a wonderful example. He says you just have to watch American Idol. You have lots of passionate people who are never going to make a living as a singer. So we have self-efficacy, risk-taking, as passion as the sort of three that come to mind. And then the next three that come to mind are innovation, opportunism, and learning.
And we'll find out more after this. And in the studio, we have AnwarJumabhoy, who recently wrote about 9 Entrepreneurisms. And we're learning about it today so that large companies can sort of apply these characteristics into their processes. So we've covered self-efficacy, risk-taking, and passion. And up next, we'll find out more. This is Resource Center. Stay with us, BFM 89.9. Good afternoon. You're still listening to Resource Center. And today we have AnwarJumabhoy, who recently wrote about 9 entrepreneurisms, because you identify the problems of large companies that are facing in this changing situation in this world. So we've covered self-efficacy, risk-taking, passion. So what are the next few entrepreneurisms?
I would say the next here, innovation, opportunism, and learning. All right. And innovation, and they sort of go together, right? So the other interesting thing about the entrepreneurisms is it's rare that a person or a company can have all 9. Because there are some internal conflicts, right? So realism is one, for example, and we'll cover that later. But you can't be realistic and opportunistic. So at different points in time, companies will need to be more realistic or more opportunistic or be more learning. So if we talk about these three, which is innovation, opportunism, and learning, and IKEA is a wonderful example of this, right? So IKEA's invention was flat packing, right? And that, I think, happened in 1956. After that, I would say they have not innovated at all. What they've done is they've learned a hell of a lot about the market, about how to produce quality products, about how to produce in scale. So they've taken one concept, which is flat packing, which is their innovation, and around that they've learned and they've taken an opportunistic view of what can we produce that we can sell in large numbers across the world. And they have now, I think, about 360 stores, right? There's no secret to what they do. Anybody can compete with them. Well, if you have the money, you have the resources. But their business frame, as we call it, as opposed to business model, is pretty clear to everybody, right? Find a product, make it attractive, make it cheap, make it in large numbers, and see if you can sell it in multiple countries. So that comes from learning, right? So they're opportunistic and learning. And it's important to learn. Now, Google, for example, again, another learning company, right? They're continually learning. They've launched a number of products that have failed. They've learned from it. And they keep learning as they produce new products, right? So it's important to have this learning built into your organization. And a lot of people say that knowledge, for example, right, comes from the feedback loop. So why is online learning not as successful as classroom learning? And one of the reasons is because it lacks that feedback loop, right? That feedback loop is what reinforces learning. So if you spend time with your customers, if you have enough iterations, and that's one of the problems, for example, for startup companies in Malaysia, they don't get enough iterative cycles with customers. And if you don't get those cycles, you don't learn. So when I was in MAVCAP, for example, a couple of our companies, they built customers here, 1 or 2 in Singapore, 1 or 2 in Hong Kong. But if you can't build enough of them quickly enough, you don't get that advantage of learning, right? I would say that innovation, opportunism, and learning are a nice set. Dyson, for example, look at the way they've innovated.
They're fans.
They're fans. I mean, the first time I saw a Dyson bladeless fan, I just had to buy it. And this is a guy, and he, on his site, he says that he tried it 5,127 prototypes before he got it right. And he actually borrowed the concept of the centrifuge from a timber mill. So to try and clear sawdust, they use a centrifuge. So he borrowed the concept.